My ex was so much better in every way, you'll never compare, she told me while dating her high school sweetheart again. I wished them well and moved on completely. 3 years later, she's single and crying outside my office asking if I still love her. The engagement ring was still hidden in my sock drawer when Monica called that Tuesday evening to tell me she was leaving me for her high school sweetheart. We'd been living together for 2 years in our apartment near Tempe Town Lake, where I'd grown comfortable with our Sunday morning routine of trail walks and farmers market coffee, never suspecting she found our life together as suffocating as a poorly ventilated building. I'm a civil engineer for the city of Phoenix, the kind of guy who believes in strong foundations, careful planning, and building things that last, principles I'd applied to our relationship with the same methodical care I brought to designing bridges and infrastructure projects. Just 3 weeks before that devastating phone call, I'd spent my lunch breaks visiting jewelry stores in Scottsdale, comparing diamond cuts and settings, mentally rehearsing the proposal I'd planned for our upcoming vacation to Sedona, where I'd reserved a table at Lauberge overlooking Oak Creek, the same spot where she'd first told me she loved me 2 years earlier. The ring I'd chosen was a classic solitaire with a princess-cut diamond, something timeless and elegant that matched her style, and I'd even gotten approval from her best friend Sarah about the design, feeling confident and excited about taking this next step in our relationship. But that Tuesday evening in March, as I sat in my office reviewing blueprints for a new water treatment facility, Monica's call shattered everything I thought I knew about us. "Alex, we need to talk," she said, and something in her voice immediately made my stomach drop, that flat, distant tone people use when they've already made a decision and are just going through the motions of delivering bad news. "I can't do this anymore," she continued without preamble, her words cutting through the phone line like a knife. "Ryan's back in town, and we've been talking, and I realize now that what we had in high school was real love, not this safe, comfortable thing you and I have been settling for." Ryan, her high school sweetheart who'd moved to Los Angeles after graduation to pursue some vague dreams of becoming an actor or influencer, the guy whose photos still occasionally popped up on her social media with captions about following your passion and living your best life, that always made me roll my eyes. "Monica, what are you saying exactly?" I asked, setting down my pen and feeling that familiar engineers need to understand the structural integrity of what was happening to my life. "I'm saying Ryan was always so much better in every way. He was captain of the football team. He has this confidence and charisma that makes everyone notice him when he walks into a room, and being with him feels electric and alive in a way that you and I just don't," she said, and I could hear her voice getting stronger, more convinced with each word. "You're a good guy, Alex, really you are, but you'll never compare to what Ryan and I had, what we still have. He makes me feel like the most important person in the world, not just someone who fits neatly into your 5-year plan." The irony wasn't lost on me that she was criticizing my planning while I literally had an engagement ring receipt in my wallet, but I stayed quiet, letting her continue this character assassination that felt like watching a controlled demolition of everything we'd built together. "You're safe but boring, Alex. You come home at the same time every day, you want to watch Netflix and cook dinner and talk about water main repairs or whatever project you're working on, and that's fine for some people, but I need more than that," she said, her voice gaining momentum like she'd been practicing this speech. "Ryan just got back from LA where he was working on this amazing startup, and he has all these stories about celebrity parties and business deals, and when he talks about the future, it's not about 401k contributions and mortgage rates, it's about really living, about taking risks and chasing dreams." I found myself staring at the framed photo on my desk of us hiking Camelback Mountain last fall, both of us grinning and sweaty and happy, and wondering when exactly that version of us had become insufficient for her. "I've already moved my stuff out," she continued, and I realized this wasn't a conversation at all. It was a notification, a unilateral decision being delivered with the courtesy of a text message breakup, but the personal touch of hearing my inadequacy explained in real time. "Sarah helped me get my things while you were at work today, and I left your key on the kitchen counter." The practical part of my brain immediately started cataloging what this meant, splitting the lease, dividing the furniture we'd bought together, updating my emergency contacts at work, while the emotional part felt like I'd been sucker punched by someone I'd trusted completely. "For years, Monica," I finally said, my voice steadier than I felt. "4 years, and you're ending this with a phone call because your high school boyfriend came back to town and suddenly I'm not exciting enough?" "It's not about excitement, Alex. It's about passion, about feeling alive with someone instead of just existing comfortably," she replied, and I could picture her pacing around whatever friend's apartment she was calling from, probably gesturing dramatically the way she did when she was trying to convince herself as much as her audience. Ryan and I have this connection that transcends the ordinary, this electric chemistry that makes everything feel possible, and I can't pretend anymore that what you and I have is enough when I know what real love actually feels like. The words hit exactly where she intended them to, making me question not just our relationship but my entire approach to life, love, and what it meant to be worth choosing. I hope you understand, she said, her tone softening slightly, probably realizing she'd been particularly brutal. You'll find someone who appreciates your stability, and I really do wish you the best. After she hung up, I sat in my office until the cleaning crew arrived, staring at those blueprints and thinking about how you can engineer a perfect foundation, follow every best practice and safety protocol, and still watch the whole structure collapse because you miscalculated the load it was designed to bear. I could have called her back, could have driven to wherever she was staying and demanded we talk this through like adults, could have pointed out that Ryan had already abandoned her once when bigger opportunities called from Los Angeles, but instead I did something that apparently surprised everyone who knew us. I took her at her word. When I got home that night and saw my keys sitting alone on the kitchen counter like a period at the end of a sentence, I didn't feel the urge to fight for someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth fighting for. I hope you find everything you're looking for with Ryan. I texted her the next morning, my only response to the 3 missed calls and 2 voicemails she'd left overnight, messages I deleted without listening to because I figured if she had something important to say, she'd had 4 years to say it. The next weekend, I methodically packed my belongings into boxes labeled with the same precise handwriting I used for engineering reports, taking only what was clearly mine and leaving behind the furniture we'd bought together, the kitchen appliances we'd registered for last Christmas, and the framed photos of us that suddenly felt like evidence of a crime I hadn't known I was committing. I found a studio apartment in downtown Phoenix, a clean, efficient space in a converted warehouse building where I could walk to work and wouldn't have to drive past any of the restaurants or coffee shops that had become part of our routine. Before I moved my last box, I went through my phone and social media accounts with the same systematic approach I'd used to update project files after a client meeting, blocking Monica on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, not out of anger but out of the practical recognition that watching someone else live your replacement life wasn't going to help anyone heal. When our mutual friends started reaching out with carefully worded texts asking what had happened, I gave them all the same response. Monica and I decided to go our separate ways, and I wish her nothing but happiness. The consistency of my answer seemed to frustrate people who were expecting drama or at least some juicy details they could dissect over happy hour drinks, but I wasn't about to trash talk someone I genuinely cared about just because she decided I wasn't enough. My friend Jake from the volleyball league actually seemed disappointed when I wouldn't elaborate, saying, "Dude, she basically told you that you're boring and dumped you for her ex, aren't you pissed?" "What's the point of being pissed?" I replied, focusing on the beer in my hands rather than the expectation in his eyes. She made her choice, and honestly, if Ryan makes her happier than I could, then maybe she did us both a favor. The weird thing was, I actually meant it, not the part about doing me a favor because getting your heart shattered definitely didn't feel like a kindness, but the part about wanting her to be happy. If Monica needed electric chemistry and celebrity party stories and someone who made her feel like the center of the universe, then she deserved to have that. And I deserve to be with someone who didn't find my steady presence as exciting as watching paint dry. The first month after Monica left, I threw myself into work with the kind of intensity usually reserved for emergency repairs during monsoon season, volunteering for every challenging infrastructure project the city had on the books and staying late to perfect designs that were already more than adequate. When the transportation department needed someone to lead the preliminary engineering for a new light rail extension connecting downtown Phoenix to the airport, I raised my hand before anyone else could speak, knowing that the technical complexity and regulatory hurdles would require the kind of focused attention that left no room for dwelling on failed relationships. But the real breakthrough came when I discovered rock climbing at South Mountain, initially just looking for a weekend activity that would get me out of my studio apartment where the silence had become deafening, but finding something that demanded complete mental presence in a way that made everything else disappear. There's something profoundly therapeutic about hanging 40 feet off the ground, trusting your equipment and your technique while your brain has to shut off every worry except the next handhold, and I started going twice a week, then 3 times, until I was leading routes that would have terrified the version of me who'd been content with farmers market walks. The physical challenge led me to join a recreational volleyball league downtown, partly because my climbing buddies kept inviting me and partly because I'd realized that Monica wasn't entirely wrong about my social life needing some expansion beyond work colleagues and Netflix. Tuesday and Thursday evening games became something I actually looked forward to, surrounded by engineers and teachers and small business owners who had no idea about my recent romantic failures and seemed to appreciate my reliable serve and steady teamwork without needing me to be anyone other than exactly who I was. I also started taking Spanish classes at the community college on Monday nights, something I'd been meaning to do for years since half my job involved working with Spanish-speaking contractors and community members, but had always found excuses to postpone when Monica wanted to spend evenings planning weekend trips or watching reality TV shows about people with more dramatic problems than ours. Learning a new language at 28 felt like proof that my brain wasn't as set in its ways as Monica had implied, and there was something satisfying about the methodical progression from basic vocabulary to actual conversations with my instructor, Mrs. Hernandez, who had infinite patience for my engineering-precise pronunciation attempts. The most meaningful change came when I started volunteering with Habitat for Humanity on Saturday mornings, swinging hammers and installing drywall for families who'd never owned homes before, working alongside retirees and college students and other volunteers who showed up consistently not because they had to but because they wanted to build something good in the world. There's a particular satisfaction in framing walls and installing electrical systems for people who've been saving and hoping for years to have a place that's truly theirs, and I found myself looking forward to those early mornings more than any date night I'd had with Monica, probably because the work felt purposeful in a way that dinner conversations about her coworkers' drama never had. Each weekend, as I watched families walk through their nearly completed homes for the first time, measuring rooms and planning where furniture would go, I realized I was reconstructing my own life with the same careful attention to detail I brought to building theirs, laying a foundation that could support whatever came next instead of just hoping the existing structure would somehow hold together indefinitely. 3 years later, I barely recognized the man Monica had dismissed as safe and boring, though the transformation hadn't happened overnight but rather through the same methodical approach I brought to everything else, consistent effort compounding into results that surprised even me. The light rail project I'd volunteered for during my darkest post-breakup days had evolved into leading the design for a major transit corridor connecting Phoenix to Scottsdale, a $180 million infrastructure initiative that put me in regular meetings with city council members and earned me a feature article in Arizona Highways magazine about innovative urban planning. When Mayor Gallego personally thanked me at the groundbreaking ceremony, calling the project a model for sustainable development that other cities will study for decades, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with impressing anyone else and everything to do with knowing I'd helped build something that would improve thousands of people's daily lives. My rock climbing had progressed from those tentative first routes at South Mountain to leading weekend expeditions up Camelback Mountain's more technical faces, guiding newer climbers through the same mental and physical challenges that had helped me rebuild my confidence after Monica's departure. There's something profound about belaying someone through their first difficult climb, watching them discover they're capable of more than they believed possible, and I'd found a community of adventurous, grounded people who shared my appreciation for both calculated risks and meticulous preparation. The Spanish classes had paid off beyond my wildest expectations. Not only was I fluent enough to conduct community meetings entirely in Spanish, but I'd started volunteering as a translator for immigrant families navigating the city's permitting process, helping them understand building codes and zoning requirements in their own language. Mrs. Hernandez still sent me articles in Spanish about engineering innovations in Latin America, proud of her former student who'd gone from struggling with conjugations to being featured in Univision's coverage of the transit project. I'd bought a modern townhouse in Roosevelt Row, the arts district downtown where galleries and coffee shops had replaced empty lots, a 3-bedroom place with clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected both my improved financial situation and my evolved aesthetic sense. The promotion to senior project manager had come with a 40% salary increase, but more importantly, it had given me the confidence to start A&M Consulting on weekends, specializing in sustainable urban development for smaller municipalities that couldn't afford the big engineering firms. My first client was the town of Wickenburg, where I designed a water conservation system that reduced their municipal usage by 30% while actually improving service reliability, the kind of elegant solution that proved Monica wrong about my capacity for innovation and risk-taking. The real validation came when Phoenix Business Journal named me to their 30 under 30 list of rising professionals, with a write-up that described my work as combining technical excellence with environmental consciousness to create infrastructure that serves both current needs and future generations. The photo they used was from the Camelback mountain climbing expedition I'd led for a team-building exercise with my consulting clients, all of us grinning and dusty after successfully summiting the most challenging route I'd attempted, looking like someone who'd never been told he was too boring to keep a woman's interest. The shy, predictable engineer who'd been dumped for his high school rival had become someone who designed transit systems by day, led rock climbing expeditions on weekends, conducted business meetings in 3 languages, and ran a consulting firm that was booked solid through the next fiscal year, not because I'd tried to become someone else, but because I'd finally had the space to become fully myself. I was leaving my downtown office on a Tuesday evening in October, mentally reviewing the presentation I'd give to the city council the next morning about Phase 2 of the transit project, when I spotted someone sitting on the concrete steps of our building who looked vaguely familiar but completely out of place. At first glance, I thought it might be a homeless person who'd found shelter in the alcove, but as I got closer, something about the posture and the hair color made my steps slow, and then stop completely when I realized I was looking at Monica, though a version of her I'd never seen before, disheveled and hollow-eyed, crying quietly into her hands like she'd been there for hours. She looked up when my shadow fell across the steps, and the recognition in her red-rimmed eyes was immediately followed by something that looked like shame mixed with desperate relief, as if she'd been hoping I'd appear but dreading the moment it actually happened. "Alex," she said, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper, "I've been waiting for you." The woman who'd once dismissed me as boring and predictable was wearing clothes that looked like they'd been slept in, her usually perfect hair unwashed and hanging limp around a face that had lost at least 20 pounds, giving her cheekbones a sharp, almost skeletal appearance that spoke of stress and poor nutrition. "Monica, what are you doing here?" I asked, settling my laptop bag more securely on my shoulder while maintaining what I hoped was a safe distance, both physically and emotionally. "How did you even know where I work?" "I saw the article in Phoenix Business Journal," she said, wiping her nose with the back of her hand in a gesture that was startlingly childlike coming from someone who'd once been so concerned with appearances. "About your transit project and the consulting company, and I needed to see you." She took a shaky breath and looked up at me with eyes that held 3 years' worth of regret and something that looked dangerously close to desperation. "Ryan left me," she said simply, and then the floodgates opened, words tumbling out between sobs like she'd been holding them back for months. "He left me 6 months ago, but really he destroyed everything long before that. He wasn't who I thought he was, Alex, not even close." I found myself sitting down on the steps despite every instinct telling me to keep walking, partly because Monica looked like she might collapse if I left, and partly because I needed to hear what had happened to the confident woman who'd been so certain that Ryan represented everything I could never be. "He started changing right after we got back together," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she began what felt like a confession she'd been practicing. "At first it was little things. He didn't like my friends, said they were holding me back from becoming the person I could be with him, and it felt romantic, like he saw potential in me that other people missed." She laughed bitterly, a sound that had no joy in it whatsoever. "Within 6 months, I'd stopped talking to Sarah, stopped going to the book club I'd been in for 2 years, stopped doing anything that didn't involve Ryan or his approval." The picture she painted was devastating in its familiarity, classic emotional manipulation dressed up as devotion, isolation disguised as exclusive attention, control presented as care. "He convinced me to quit my graphic design job because he said it was beneath me, that I should focus on building our life together while he handled the finances," she said, staring at her hands like she couldn't believe her own stupidity. "Except there were no finances to handle, all those stories about his successful startup in LA, the celebrity connections, the business deals, it was all lies, Alex. He was living off credit cards and charm, bouncing from couch to couch and making it sound like adventure." I felt a mixture of vindication and genuine sadness as she described how Ryan had gradually taken control of her bank account, her credit cards, even her car, all under the guise of managing their resources more efficiently, while he pursued various get-rich-quick schemes that never materialized into actual income. "The cheating started early, but I didn't want to see it," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Other women would text his phone when I was sitting right there, and he'd say they were business contacts or old friends, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. She looked up at me with eyes that held a painful awareness of her own willingness to be deceived. I found out about all of them eventually. Sarah from his gym, the bartender at that place on Mill Avenue, even my old coworker Jessica who he met at my company's Christmas party, and when I confronted him, he said it was my fault for being boring and needy and not giving him the space he needed to be successful. The final blow had come when Ryan simply disappeared one morning, taking her car, her credit cards, and the last $3,000 from her savings account, leaving behind only a note that said he'd found someone who understood his vision and couldn't be dragged down by negativity anymore. I lost my apartment because I couldn't make rent without his income, which turned out to be mostly my income anyway, and had to move back in with my parents in Glendale, she said, the words coming out like physical pain. I'm 31 years old, Alex, living in my childhood bedroom, working part-time at a coffee shop because my references from my old job are useless after 3 years, and I can barely get through a day without having panic attacks about how completely I destroyed my life. The irony was so sharp it almost felt cruel. The man she'd claimed was so much better in every way had systematically dismantled everything good in her life while I, the supposedly inadequate backup plan, had built something extraordinary from the foundation of that rejection. We sat in silence for several minutes while Monica composed herself, wiping her face with tissues from a travel pack she pulled from her purse, and I found myself studying this broken version of someone I'd once planned to marry, trying to reconcile the confident woman who dismissed me so cruelly with the fragile person sitting beside me on these concrete steps. When she finally looked up at me again, there was something different in her eyes, not just regret, but a calculating desperation that made me instinctively lean back, recognizing the look of someone about to ask for something they had no right to request. Alex, I know I have absolutely no right to say this after what I did to you, but I need to ask you something, she began, her voice steadying as she shifted into what felt like a rehearsed speech. Do you think there's any possibility, any chance at all, that we could try again? The question hung in the evening air like smog, and I felt a familiar engineer's impulse to analyze the structural integrity of what she was proposing, examining it from every angle before determining whether it could bear any weight. Monica, what exactly are you asking me? I said carefully, watching her face cycle through hope, desperation, and something that looked like strategic thinking. I'm asking if you still love me, she said, reaching out as if to touch my arm before apparently thinking better of it. Because I never stopped loving you, Alex. I was just confused and stupid and thought I wanted something else, but these 3 years have taught me that stability and kindness matters so much more than excitement and passion. She was gaining momentum now, like a sales pitch she'd been perfecting, and I recognized the same persuasive energy she'd once used to convince me to spend $200 on concert tickets for bands I'd never heard of. I made the biggest mistake of my life when I left you, and I've regretted it every single day since, she continued, tears starting fresh but somehow seeming more performative than the raw grief she'd shown earlier. I know now what real love looks like. It's not fireworks and drama. It's someone who shows up every day, who builds something solid and lasting, who treats you with respect even when things get difficult. The words sounded nice, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was describing the benefits package of a relationship rather than actual feelings for me as a person. I've been following your career online, and Alex, I am so amazed by what you've accomplished, she said, her voice taking on an almost breathless quality. The transit project, the consulting company, that article calling you one of Phoenix's rising leaders, you've become everything I always knew you could be, and I feel like such an idiot for not seeing it before. There it was, the confirmation that she'd been researching my life, calculating my worth, determining whether I'd become successful enough to warrant her renewed interest. I keep thinking about all the good times we had together, she continued, apparently interpreting my silence as encouragement. Remember our first apartment? How we'd cook dinner together every Sunday and plan out our week. Remember that trip to Flagstaff where we got snowed in and just talked for hours about everything we wanted to build together? She was cherry-picking memories like a real estate agent highlighting a property's best features while ignoring the structural problems. And I found myself wondering if she'd forgotten about all the time she'd complained about those same quiet Sunday evenings being boring. We could have all of that again, but better, she said, leaning closer with the intensity of someone making a final argument to a jury. We're both older now, wiser, we know what really matters. We could build something incredible together, Alex, something even stronger than what we had before. I watched her face as she spoke, seeing not the woman I'd once loved but someone desperately trying to trade on a connection that had died 3 years ago, and I realized that Monica was still the same person who'd left me. She just learned to frame her self-interest in more palatable terms. "You've grown so much, become so successful and confident," she continued, apparently mistaking my analytical silence for consideration. "And I've learned what it means to lose something precious, to understand the value of a man who actually shows up and builds something real instead of just making promises he never keeps." The last part came out with a bitterness that was clearly directed at Ryan, and I understood that this wasn't really about wanting me back. It was about needing someone to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices, and I happened to be the most convenient candidate who'd proven himself capable of providing the stability she now desperately needed. I listened to everything Monica said with the same careful attention I'd give to a client explaining their infrastructure needs, recognizing the genuine pain behind her words while also hearing the strategic calculation that made this feel less like a reconciliation attempt and more like a business proposal disguised as romance. When she finally finished speaking and looked at me with desperate hopefulness, I took a long breath and reached into my wallet, pulling out one of my business cards and writing something on the back before handing it to her. "Monica, I can see that you're going through something incredibly difficult, and I'm genuinely sorry that Ryan turned out to be someone who would hurt you like that," I said, watching her face fall slightly as she realized this wasn't going in the direction she'd hoped. The name on the back is Dr. Sarah Martinez. She's a therapist who helped me work through some difficult times after we broke up, and she has a sliding scale for people who are struggling financially. She stared at the card like it was a rejection letter, which in a way it was, though I hoped she could eventually see it as something more constructive. "Alex, I'm not asking for therapy recommendations," she said, her voice taking on an edge of frustration. "I'm asking if you still love me, if there's any chance for us to rebuild what we had." The directness of the question deserved an equally direct answer, even though I could see it wasn't what she wanted to hear. "No, Monica, I don't love you anymore," I said as gently as I could manage. "I haven't for a long time, and honestly, I'm not the same person you left 3 years ago, and you're not the same person I was in love with back then either." I watched her process this information, her face cycling through denial, anger, and what looked like genuine shock that I wasn't immediately grateful for her return. "The man you're asking to take you back doesn't exist anymore," I continued, standing up and adjusting my laptop bag. "And the woman I loved wouldn't have needed to lose everything before recognizing that stability and kindness have value. She would have appreciated those qualities from the beginning." There was no anger in my voice, no desire to hurt her further, just the quiet confidence that comes from finally understanding your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve. "Monica, you need to focus on rebuilding your own life rather than trying to reclaim a past that honestly wasn't as good as you're remembering it," I said, pulling my car keys from my pocket. "Find a good therapist, maybe consider some job training programs to get back into graphic design, work on understanding why you were willing to give up everything for someone who treated you badly, but don't do any of that for me or because you think it'll win me back." She looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in our conversation, they seemed completely genuine rather than strategic. "I really did love you, Alex," she said quietly. "I know that now." "I believe you," I replied, and I meant it. "But love isn't just a feeling, Monica. It's a choice you make every day about how to treat someone, and 3 years ago you chose to treat me like I wasn't good enough for you." I started walking toward the parking garage, then paused and turned back one last time. "I hope you find whatever it is you're really looking for, and I hope you learn to value the right things before you find it." As I walked to my car, I felt something I hadn't expected, not vindication or satisfaction, but genuine gratitude for the painful experience that had forced me to become the person I was meant to be. Behind me, Monica remained on the steps, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd lost, not just in terms of my success or stability, but in terms of losing someone who genuinely loved her and whom she'd thrown away for a fantasy that had turned into a nightmare. The engineer in me appreciated the symmetry of it all. 3 years ago, she'd rejected the foundation I offered for the excitement of something flashier and less stable, and now she was discovering that strong foundations aren't boring, they're essential, and once you've damaged them beyond repair, you can't just decide to rebuild on the same ground and expect the same results.